It's nice to be back. Surprised me, it's actually more than 5 years since I was last here. And of course, that means I wasn't here. I was in the old shop. So it's great to be here in the new home, which is wonderful. And with you all. So thank you to all of you as well for turning out this evening, and to everyone logged in online, wherever you are. I'm really happy to see some interest in the topic, and looking forward to hearing actually from all of you as well about this issue. So before I go any further, I wanted to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and the Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands we're meeting on. And I respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders, past, present, and emerging. In the past 20 years, there's been a strengthening of human rights across the UN system. I've been told to be very patient with the slides, and I will do so. When I last came to speak here at the Institute, I showed this slide. I don't know if you can see on your left there, but it basically painted a pretty bleak picture of what it meant to be a civilian in the world. So back in May 2019, and the plight was a context of the increase of active conflicts around the world, unprecedented forced displacement, civilian casualties in war were on the rise or up, and there was increasingly a climate of impunity. International humanitarian law, norms around human rights and civilian protection were being routinely violated with little, or let's be honest, not really any at all in the way of accountability. So phrases like impunity is back in fashion, and the era of tyranny is back with us, things like this. And tragically, today, you don't need me really to tell you, on just about all of these metrics, things are looking worse. And moreover, they're tracking in the wrong direction at quite a rate as well. So all of those things are happening in droves. All of these things are affecting civilians around the world, affected by conflict in particular. But in these conflicts, while we see major conflict dynamics and in some ways traditional conventional warfare being also back on vogue, it's all happening because the music, the lights, it's the disco. I thought that started after. But if we look at what's driving conflict and what perhaps lies beneath some of the conflict dynamics we witness, things like exclusion, discrimination, and human rights violations are actually what we often see driving and, importantly, prolonging conflict. And this is coinciding with the degradation or the decline in, broadly writ, the rule of law and accountability, as I mentioned, not only at that international level in terms of international criminal justice, but also at the local level within conflict settings. And there's a lot of research that's been done over many years reinforcing the idea that these are important aspects. Horizontal inequalities are fundamental to understanding how conflict progresses. I'll come back to ideas about the conflict cycle a bit later. But in the meantime, so tracking back, in the past 20 years or so, in fact, since the last global summit, something else I'll come back to a bit later, there's been a strengthening of human rights across the UN's work. So mainstreaming human rights as a set of principles, as a set of practices across the breadth of the UN system, with actually some quite powerful results. And in particular, UN peace operations, I'll define that term a bit more in a moment, but as a bundle or an umbrella term of activities, operational activities of the UN, have increasingly integrated quite robust human rights mandates. They've recognized the vital role of human rights in conflict prevention and management, and especially concerning the civilian protection aspects of these missions, but also governance deficits in fragile, conflict-affected societies. But today, so fast forward to today, after this sort of 20 years, 30 years of institutionalization, incremental, kind of gradual internalization, if you like, of some of the norms and principles. But in many of the fragile and conflict-affected settings, hosting UN field missions of various descriptions, not just big ones, places like the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Sudan, in Mali, South Sudan, Yemen, and many other so-called forgotten conflicts that elude perhaps the UN Security Council's high politics agenda. In places like that, we've seen this human rights work come increasingly under attack. There's shrinking civic and political space in many of the conflict-affected parts of the world. There's increases in direct attacks on human rights defenders, so those who put themselves at risk, most exposed in order to protect human rights. But there is this broader weakening of national justice and accountability systems. And host states, important partners for any UN activity, are increasingly sensitive, but then withdrawing of consent to those kind of UN activities. And as if that weren't difficult enough of an operational environment, the political backstopping and the financial support required to do this work is also under threat including by some of the UN member states who have been some of the biggest proponents of this. It's not only those blockers and problem states that we might think of. Member states in the Security Council are not necessarily defending important language in mandates on women, peace and security, or the protection of children. And they're tied up and connected to other politically sensitive debates. But the money is simply not there as well. Often member states make highfalutin commitments in political mandates through the council, and then the very same countries, member states, will go to the fifth committee of the General Assembly, which I won't bore you with the details, but I've spent a long time in that committee. That's where the money gets doled out, right? That's when the words are met with deeds, or they're not. And increasingly, they're not. So human rights will be given as a political mandate, but not delivered as a resource to allow that to be done. So frontline actors within the UN system, but actually many others, are expected to do a whole lot more because of the context, but with fewer and fewer resources, support, access, and space, organizational, institutional space, but also political space. And this comes 75 years after the passage of a landmark Universal Declaration on Human Rights. It's also at a moment in time where the future of peacekeeping missions, which people have some idea often of, but this broader set of peace operations, peace and security initiatives through the UN system, are being discussed in terms of their viability, their political feasibility going forward in the future. What will they look like? What should they look like? This is in the context of the Summit of the Future, which takes place in 2.5 weeks. So it's timely that we're here discussing this. I think it's also the thing that made us feel it was quite urgent to conduct this piece of work in order to try and put an evidentiary base around some of the claims, often normative talk around rights and principles, to try and say this is actually effective. This actually brings leverage to the UN system and actually is important to resolving some of the deeper seated sources of conflict and instability. So with that backdrop, what did we do? Patiently, we wrote a big report, which is actually a book length thing. So I'll later on, so I don't want you reading it instead of listening to me, I'll later give a QR code where you can freely access this. But we are, as Alistair said, the Effectiveness of Peace Operations Network, which I was part of setting up some time ago, back in 2017. It's a coalition of research organizations, some within the academy, some in think tanks, who came together, all concerned with this idea of independently assessing the effectiveness of UN intervention, UN peace and security initiatives as a way of trying to improve them, trying to provide research which helped incrementally shift and change the behavior on the ground, but also evidence good practices and ways to learn lessons. Previously, it was quite case specific. So I led previously a South Sudan study, and actually we did a few iterations of that. And so we went to all the big missions, then we went to some of the smaller missions, and then we started thinking, well, what could we do next? And we began thinking about these thematic studies. So there's quite a few out there, all freely available, all done by excellent researchers, except this one, of course, which I did. The rest of them are all highly skilled researchers. But these thematic studies on women, peace and security, protection of civilians, various other thematic elements. But we said, well, okay, let's get 9 co-authors from 7 different organizations around the world. It's a real acronym soup. I won't tell you who everyone was involved, but I'm sure you'd be familiar with some of them. But importantly, from all over the world, men, women, no children involved, from various UN entities, big think tanks in Europe, in Africa. And we collaborated quite closely with the UN's Department of Peace Operations, the Department of Peace Building and Political Affairs, DPPA, and OHCHR, the Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights. So it's independent, but a close relationship as we've had all along. We can talk a bit more about that if anyone's interested in what it means to do truly independent research if you're being flown around by the UN in conflict zones, because that's a bit of a tension. But the key aim was, as it says, to explore, firstly, the effects of peace operations on the promotion and protection of human rights. So this idea of doing human rights work, protecting human rights. But also, and importantly, we thought the value add would really be this secondary point about how human rights work, and having human rights as a core part of a mandate actually can enable a number of other mission activities, sometimes some of the major objectives of the mission. So we set out to identify some of these novel approaches, innovations that were working well, and ask why, and identify and put some evidence around why that was the case, as well as looking to try and reveal the impediments to greater effectiveness and ways that they might improve. So the key research questions really attached to those 2 aims. The cases are fascinating, and each one on their own would warrant a much longer talk than I could give in this evening. So I'm not going to go into great detail, but what's important here is that we wanted to reflect human rights efforts work across a broad spectrum of field missions. You've heard me refer to this a bit differently. I'm not just talking about peacekeeping. And it's because this is a long-held concern that many of us have about the way the UN is structured. It often separates human rights, peace and security, and development across the pillars, and things get organized that way. They create silos. But particularly when it comes to peace building and peacekeeping, there's been this artificial divide, which has really become ingrained and entrenched. And there was, in fact, an organizational reform a few years back deliberately targeted to try and undo that, to unmake that distinction and make it more shared and integrated. Failed dramatically. Still a huge issue. And the problem is primarily around turf. So there's competition over resources. It's an internal bureaucratic issue. Everyone's very aware of this. They don't like talking about it very much. They try and reform it every few years or so, and nothing much seems to change. But we didn't want to fall into the same trap. So we wanted to look at big peacekeeping missions, those which we might be familiar with, those that have the military, police, and civilian components. But we also wanted to look at what are often called special political missions, SPMs. So they're run from the DPPA side of the house, but they'll often have, they can sometimes still be multi-dimensional. They can have a few police in them, it may be, but they're primarily political efforts, supporting a peace process, dealing with things in a relationship with host governments. But we wanted to push beyond that as well, because many of the problems our other studies have revealed is that many of the problems that peacekeeping missions face are because they exist across borders. Peacekeeping missions get deployed within a country, and their mandate politically is to operate within the borders of that country with the host government's consent. As soon as the problem or the issue spills over a border, it's like the old Western movies where the sheriff can no longer go over the border. I think I've only seen one, a Johnny Cash one that was really good. But this idea, you know, the classic kind of idea, stop at the border and, oh, so long, I guess it's someone else's problem. But of course, we know that global insecurity is profoundly networked. It's about complex problems that are about relational dynamics across national borders and across different features. So we wanted to look at regional efforts, and the UN has regional offices, primarily prevention offices, but in West Africa and Central Africa. So we included as many different types as we could, and we took a bit of a broad swathe to get our case studies selected. It's a bit Africa biased, but you would expect that. The Security Council still spends about 70% of its time talking about Africa, peace and security issues in Africa. So, and when you add what the General Assembly does on the SDGs and so on, it makes sense, really. So anyway, we had the Congo, South Sudan, and Mali in the big peacekeeping mission or stabilization mission bundle, special political missions that had a Security Council mandate, a unique kind of brand of them, in Afghanistan and Yemen, and then special political missions that don't have a Security Council mandate in a few other regions, but with this idea of the Regional Prevention Office, but also special envoys offices, who are quite an important aspect of the UN system that many people don't know anything about or much about, where they're the equivalent of the head of a peacekeeping mission, but in a region or so the Horn of Africa, for example, has a special envoy of the Secretary General, and she is the most impressive UN official I've ever met in my life, Hannah Tete from Ghana. And she is involved in the Ethiopian transitional justice issues, in conflict resolution in Sudan, in Somalia, in South Sudan, and dealing with regional countries, Kenya, Uganda, across the board. So it's a really interesting set of innovations that's taken place over the last few years, and we wanted to include them. Okay, I've got to move quicker. But importantly, as Alistair said, it was a year or more than a year actually, and over 400, I think, interviews, field work in all of these case studies, some actually a bit more remotely. Mali became a bit difficult when the government kicked out the UN, and the Wagner group turned up. That's a different lecture as well. So anyway, a lot of interviews, importantly with both UN, but also non-UN, and state-based representatives and authorities and security actors, as well as non-state and civil society and local community-based organizations, as much as we could try. So what did we find, or what did the research, the picture on the bottom right there was this idea that we're trying to get away from this idea of the blue helmets, right? Everyone thinks of the blue beret maybe, or the blue helmet. The blue helmet is the militarized kind of peacekeeper. This was deliberately trying not to only focus on that, to avoid falling into the trap, as I said. This is my outfit, CPR at UNU, and our comms guy who's excellent. And this is the reflex, that peace operations is about blue helmets. And so it's a really strong reflex, and it's in everyone, and it's in the system. It's something that I think is really important to think differently about as we go forward. So maybe we can discuss that later, because as we look forward ahead to the future of peace operations and the summit of the future, we're really going to need to break out some of the molds that we're stuck in, I think. So key findings and recommendations. Well, first and overall, we found that these fundamental activities that are essentially the OHCHR, the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights mandate, which was given by the General Assembly as a UN agency. Those activities that happen under the auspices of a UN mission in the field have some tangible impact. They actually do reduce violence, and they do deter and change behaviors at times. Not always, not all of the time, not everywhere, but there is some tangible impact. And this is through things like across the 10 cases as well, remember, all the time. Monitoring, investigation, analysis, and reporting on human rights violations that happens in a quotidian, everyday sense, that this is happening, potentially deterring future violations. And like I said, changing behavior maybe of some of these key actors. But these teams across these missions also play a crucial role in building the capacity of others to promote and protect human rights. So that maybe with the host state, so with the security forces, with the judiciary, the penal system, whatever it may be, building their capacity through training and advice to be more rights respecting, but also with civil society and working with local bodies. In South Sudan, we met with a small civil society group network working on transitional justice issues within the peace agreement, for example, but empowering them, educating them in order to have their voice be at the table and be involved and integrated. So not necessarily doing the work, but being part of building capacity. National human rights institutions, supposedly independent of the state, are a big example of this work. So in a sense, peace operations quite immediately are a crucial vehicle for improving human rights outcomes in certain conflict settings. In that sense, they're a kind of key implementer of the UN's human rights pillar. Second key thing, and each of these will get us a bit more indirect or a bit more kind of one step of separation away from the core of the human rights work. Here we looked in another chapter of the report at how human rights efforts were an enabler or a kind of enhancement of other key mandated priorities. So when you look through a peacekeeping mandate, political mission mandate, which again, I've read way too many of them, you don't need to do it, but if you did, there will be key priorities. Often you might find the protection of civilians or support to a political process or the implementation of a peace agreement. Some key consistent objectives, which are often priorities rather than just one of what is often called the Christmas tree mandate, where the political mandate is this Christmas tree and everyone hangs their various ornaments on it because we need to deal with transitional justice and children's rights and so on and so forth. And they can become quite unwieldy, quite difficult mandates to implement, but the priorities. So when it comes to protection of civilians, that's POC. Often human rights are involved in strengthening the analysis of threats to civilians. So while others also do this, human rights often have access to data and networks that others don't, directing measures to prevent the harm that might be stemming from those threats, and informing advocacy of the rights of civilian populations in in conflict zones. So this idea again of supporting civilians and local communities to exercise their own agency. Second, by infusing human rights norms and principles into the mission's peacemaking or mediation efforts, human rights activities often can support a more inclusive political process in a peace agreement. So not necessarily the elite bargain idea, where it's those who have the weapons or the political capital are the only ones who get around the negotiating table, but by having human rights principles around equity and inclusion involved, you might get different outcomes. This is not always a good thing. In Yemen and in many of the other cases we looked at, bringing up human rights in certain contexts and making things contingent on human rights is extremely politically sensitive, and I'll come back to that a bit later too. But third here, by partnering and promoting legal reform, or building the capacity of local security and justice actors, systems, to ensure that human rights are respected, can be an important part of actually extending state authority and capacity building that can lead to stabilization. Lots of problems. One of the biggest problems with UN peacekeeping has been supporting states too much and expecting stabilization to happen as a result of supporting the central state. But nevertheless, plenty of examples where some of this has happened. And fourth here, the idea that by facilitating coordination between the uniform components, so the police and the military within big peacekeeping missions at least, that there's this bridging effect between the militarized component of a mission and local authorities. Human rights, as well as civil affairs and some other actors, do a lot of that work. So lots of enabling action around some of the core work: protection, political process, state building, often core to the logic of building peace after conflict in these contexts. And the last one, military is still the biggest component of most of these big missions. So if you can enable their work, make it less difficult, give them more access, better relationships, then that's probably a good thing too. Third, and this is pretty connected, you could just had one long list instead of separating this. But my old supervisor always told me do things in threes. Don't do it in two or four. People won't come with you. If it's in three, it's like makes perfect sense. So I'll go with that. But these are cross-cutting objectives. So they might not be a core priority identified in the political mandate as is your priority, but they are priorities, they are core. So the idea that by strong and consistently recording impartial human rights reporting as a mission, you actually can inform the preventive diplomacy, the good offices, help avert future cycles, where the SRSG, the head of the mission or senior leadership, can engage with their counterparts in host governments and try to get them to change their behavior. Good offices is a really important thing for the UN. When it doesn't have enforcement or host state consent is withering, good offices is really important. Those regional offices I talked about in West Africa and Central Africa, as well as the special envoys, do a lot of this work. And human rights can really enable some of that. It doesn't make it easy. It makes it easier, though, we found. Protecting civic and political space. I mentioned this in the intro about how this is either shrinking or diminishing over time. There's some new research coming out soon that I've been part of, looking at this issue in particular. But MDMH is not a new street drug for the kids. This is misinformation, disinformation, malinformation and harmful information. This is the latest UN acronym. So you've got to get your heads around this one now. It's a new one, MDMH. So, but that's a real issue. That affects missions themselves who come under attack because of misinformation, disinformation campaigns. It can really affect their local legitimacy and their ability to do everything else they're trying to do or have been asked to do. But also in the conflict system itself. I mean, the UN is part of the conflict system. I shouldn't try and separate them out. But within the conflict dynamics in a particular country or space, misinformation is driven through social media and new tech, is driving conflict as well. Or it can, as well as be a potential part of the solution. Anyway, human rights are fundamentally involved, and there's lots of examples of them being part of detecting, early detection, and some strategy formation around cross-mission approaches to dealing with mis and disinformation. Early warning, situational awareness. I talked about the protection of civilians earlier, and this kind of overlaps quite closely with that. The thing is, not all early warning and situational awareness is about protecting civilians. It's also about force protection. It's also about other engagements. So similar idea though, through analysis, through database management, through kind of everyday work on the ground in communities with relationships with local actors, there's a certain enabling effect of having that within your peace mission. Coordination across these whole of mission entities. So things like there's in fact, I'm not going to bore you with those acronyms. More acronyms about joint mission, this, and coordination, that. But all important stuff for how missions actually operate on the ground, right? Rather than the big high-level politics. What makes them work, or why don't they work when they don't? The human rights due diligence policy is so clearly connected to the human rights actors that it's almost self-explanatory, but it's actually a UN policy. So this was something that came out off the back of development in the Congo, where the UN mission was working very close, hand in glove with the Congolese armed forces, the FARDC. They would be doing joint operations to neutralize the bad guys, the irregular forces, right? Like this was war fighting, peace enforcement in the Eastern Congo, which has clearly fixed everything, as we can see if you look at it today. But as a result of having to distinguish between those military forces who you could work with and those who you couldn't, because they were deemed, or it was clear that they had human rights abuses on their records and they were known as abusers, for the UN to have due diligence over its own engagement, but use of resources, this came out. So that's another big area that we looked at. And lastly, and this one I've touched on a couple of times already as well, but human rights work very closely with all bits of these missions which are engaged in transitional justice processes. So things like truth commissions, things like international tribunals, but also much more community-based processes of reconciliation and reparations. So there's a whole range of things that human rights actors are doing through with others that enable these overall mission activities. And that became very clear. So 2 last points on the findings, and then I'll just say a few things about the broader implications as I see them to finish. So the important thing that, or at least that we found or we argued, is that many of these things, though not uniformly, of course it differs across different contexts and across time, but most of the things I just described hold across the various different mission types we looked at, which are quite different, right? It can be Hana Tete in Addis, in Ethiopia, covering the Horn of Africa with some excellent people, but a very small team of people trying to deal with this whole raft of issues. Or it can be the 15,000 strong, highly militarized, lots of installations and planes and tanks and APCs, big peacekeeping mission. Regardless, across the different mission types, many of these things helped. Human rights was a fundamental enabler, and it was a bedrock for much of the achievements that the missions have been able to have, even in places like Mali, where they were booted out, even in places like Congo, where there's been lots of challenges. There are still positive stories to tell in connection to human rights. Secondly, that this also holds regardless of the stage of the life cycle, if you like, of the mission. So whether it's this is a classic kind of conflict cycle image, but whether it's that conflict is at times escalating and violence is breaking out, or in many cases it's often that it pops up in different pockets and that the UN is responding like a kind of whack-a-mole. Now we need to go over here and now over here, because there is no political strategy which is really addressing the root causes. But that's why the human rights aspect, along with others, we argue is so important. So this idea of various points of the mission life cycle, and I won't have time to talk about transitions, but what we're seeing at the moment is actually some of the bigger missions that have been in place for sometimes 20 years or more in the Congo, for example, that they're transitioning. They've been either booted out, asked to leave kindly, please, next year, we don't need you to stay. But there's a transition process and a handover, and the UN doesn't disappear. The country team stays, a political office may come in its stead, but you draw down what was a huge capacity to physically protect people, but also do all of this other work, enable, empower human rights defenders and the media to do their work locally. But when that mission withdraws, you potentially leave them much more vulnerable to and exposed in ways that they weren't otherwise. So how do you bridge? And human rights is another aspect which can be drawn across and bridging in that regard. So different mission types, different moments in time. I was going to talk about the bridging thing. There you go. Did it already. Covered it. So is it all that easy? No, of course not. There's challenges. I actually mentioned most of these in introduction, so I won't labor the point here. But of course, what I've done is give a bit of a rosy picture in a way about all these achievements and good outcomes and good lessons to learn from this big study. But I'm talking about the Congo and Mali and Yemen, like probably a bit incongruous, right? Like we don't hear these good stories, we hear the bad stories. Well, partly that's because of the way we learn and our media, but it's also because, of course, some of these situations are still calamitous. This is a dreadful plight. And when missions are leaving at this point in time, it can be really, really concerning around what will happen. So there's many challenges to that. I talked about the political support fading in New York, the backstopping not being there to push and say, yes, we'll have human rights language in the mandates. Yes, we'll fund the positions. It's not there. Host states are emboldened. They've learned from each other. Many host countries have managed to game the UN in ways where they've said, yeah, we'll take your resources, we'll have your stabilizing effect, we'll take your support to build up our security forces, and then thanks very much, you can go now, we got this under control. But that hasn't necessarily transformed the conflict dynamics or authoritarian states. So there's some research we've done also looking at how the UN has at times been arguably culpable in enabling authoritarianism, when in fact one of its main objectives is to do quite the opposite. So What are we doing on time, Alistair? Maybe 5 minutes, is that?
Yep.
Okay, so hopefully you've seen at least that what we tried to do in the report is identify what is working and why, and what could be empowered and scaled up, if you like. But also we're not shying away from these realities that actually it's extremely difficult, and actually certainly things are not all good on the ground, and the missions can do many things better. So we made a series of recommendations. I'm not going to go through these. I think they're coming. Yeah, got it. So these are quite practical. They're targeted at the kind of Security Council, member states, various parts of the UN's human rights apparatus. So not really something we need to go into. Oh, I've skipped back, sorry. Not something we need to talk about too much now. But this last one is probably the one I wanted to just raise as a segue to finally finish by talking about what I said at the start, the future of peace operations, the summit for the future. Because what we argue, amongst other things, is that because of all these positive enabling effects, or because the potential for them, that we argue that there's probably a case to have a more rights-based approach overall. So not just having a siloed human rights capacity, but actually to leverage what it is that the human rights norms and principles bring, and mainstream that through the way missions work on the ground, but also organizationally to break down some of those big silos at the headquarters level in terms of thinking across the human rights pillar, peace and security pillar, and the development pillar. So we argue for this kind of a more rights-based approach. And I think this is something which we could talk about more in Q&A in the context of the summit of the future. So very quickly, for those who don't know, there is a summit of the future about to take place 23rd, 24th of September. So 2.5 weeks away. There's been a long process across the sweeping arrow across the screen you can see leading up to it. And I, in a small way, have been partly involved in some of these stages. But what began as a wide-scale survey at the UN's 75th anniversary in 2020, wide consultation asking people what they wanted the UN to do for them. What was their UN? What did they see the future being? It's translated into our Common Agenda Secretary General report, which was quite an ambitious report, which really came in the aftermath of, or during, basically, certainly here in Melbourne, during the pandemic. But it was this idea of non-traditional security threats taking on a much more important center of gravity and thinking about what global governance should do going forward. But quite quickly, you remember what happened in early 2022, there was a full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and things shifted again a little bit in terms of particularly what great powers thought about how the UN should be working and who for. Nevertheless, this led through a couple of stages. Again, I was involved in some reports that sort of took these ideas and tried to flesh them out and make sense of what it could look like in practice to really address some of these big existential issues of the day. And there's a series of Secretary General policy briefs that you can look at. They're all there if you'd like to. You probably can't see this on the screen, but one on an emergency platform for future pandemics or emergency crisis, pre-positioning resources to be better prepared and more equitable in the way that we respond to global pandemics. Thinking about progress in ways which are quite revolutionary in some ways, beyond gross domestic product, GDP, as a way of measuring and gauging progress and value in the world, thinking about those things quite fundamentally differently. How do we deal with new and emerging tech and the rapid development of AI in particular? How do we set the rules of the road for that, and what role for the UN? Addressing the international financial architecture, the World Bank and the IMF, like some big ideas here and some big, deeply ingrained issues, but also new ideas around how do we govern outer space and the global commons. So we have a bit more familiarity with Antarctica and the high seas and some of this, but now cyberspace and outer space. What role for the UN? What does multilateralism bring? So to wrap up, what we have coming, what we have in third draft now, as of 3 days ago, whenever this was, 27th of August, is the Pact for the Future. So at the summit, member states, it's happening at the General Assembly opening. So it's when all the heads of states and government come and stand at the podium like this and give their hopefully brief remarks to the General Assembly audience. Doesn't always work that way. But like in 2005 with the World Summit, which put in place much of the architecture, the apparatus that I've been talking about around human rights, didn't exist that much before then. At that summit, that was one of the big outcomes, as well as the peace building architecture. And it's also the time when the responsibility to protect was endorsed by heads of state. So big ideas, some which take on their own life, some which fare better than others, as time shows. But we have a draft. You can go and read it. This, I only should put this here to show you. It began as a 20-page draft. So the Namibians and the Germans are facilitating this process. All power to them. So 193 member states on 5 pillars across sustainable, everything you can think of, they're trying to cover off on, apart from the environment. We can come back to that. Climate change, the environment is a bit of an omission here. So maybe we can talk about that. But basically, 20 pages, went to member states for consultations, came back 246 pages with track changes. We all know and love track changes, right? 246 pages. And so the Germans and the Namibians meticulously worked, got it back down to 30 pages, sent it back out again. You can imagine what happened next. Anyway, it currently exists in the third draft. It's what will be discussed by member states and in theory endorsed on the 22nd, 23rd of September. It covers off on a lot of things. It talks about rethinking and adapting peace operations for a new era. There's a new agenda for peace which fits into those policy briefs as well. Sorry, this is a bit of a patchwork and I'm flying through it, but there's a big set of questions around the future of peace operations. There's also a broader set of questions about the future of global governance and human rights. As you can see here, this is their work, not mine. Human rights and gender are mainstreamed, right? So human rights is supposedly fundamental to everything in this pact, but time will tell what ends up. The latest intel I got a few hours ago, in fact, is that on this draft, certain member states, who I won't name and shame in this room right now, have pulled to pieces at the 11th hour, so much of this. So it's on the cutting block right now. This is all still live. So there's some quite bold, some quite ambitious and quite interesting ideas captured in these documents that are being put forward, but they're not, the ink is not dry yet. This is very much in play. So there's the Pact for the Future. There'll also be a declaration. I didn't realize I was doing that. Welcome. Declaration for Future Generations. And this is where I'll end, Alistair, I promise. Well, I said that. The diplomats I work with, they say, and in closing, and I will now finish with, and you have 5 ways of closing. The last one is the Global Digital Compact. This is super interesting. So if you're interested in the rules of the road for AI and new and emerging technology, there's a Global Digital Compact that will be also endorsed at the summit. And of course, the Fantasia reference here is the Sorcerer's Apprentice, the idea that unleashing the power of these new technologies without the governance and the safeguards around it, potentially problems. So that's very much happening. It looks like that's will land at the summit. The pact is much more in question about what it will look like. It will almost certainly be very lowest common denominator, right? By the time the cutting room floor is covered in text, we'll end up with a pretty vanilla pact, but it started somewhere with quite a lot of human rights language in. So to finish, back to the start, 75 years ago, 76 years ago, as we come up to it, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed. High moral, normative language, big declarative statements, which at the time was a bit difficult to negotiate through, was not loved by everyone, but there was consensus around it, in part because it was quite vague and it was quite high level. But what we saw and what I described in the decades that followed, and particularly the last 20 years, was a cascade effect where people then were able to be put to work build up the apparatus, the architecture, the policy, and the operational activities to build up the capacity to now have this human rights work, which I've been talking about, imperfect and limited, but nevertheless real. This is something which might come out of this summit, regardless of the battling that's going on in the background as we speak. A similar declaration, but for the needs and to some extent the rights of future generations, thinking through what it means to balance needs now against those of future generations. And this is holistic, and this is a rights-based discussion as well. So this is something which we might be able to look forward to coming out of the summit. I don't know what more we should expect, but I'm happy to talk more about any questions and comments.